Alright, so for Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, we will be covering stress. I would say that out of the topics that we cover, probably the relationship between stress and health is probably the most interesting, at least from a psychological standpoint. Psychology just has a lot of room to explain the relationship between stress and the outcomes of health in terms of mental health and also physical health, as we will read on. The notion that stress impacts our health in many ways was actually discovered on accident, just like other scientific finds out there. It was discovered by a Hungarian endocrinologist or biologist basically named Hans Seeley, who was working with rats to understand the impact of a certain hormone on their body. He found, once he was injecting these rats with this hormone, that they were all developing ulcers, and his first notion was to think that this was due to the hormone. He then, though, realized that the rats that were given the saline, or basically his control rats, were also subject to having developed a lot of ulcers. So this was kind of the conundrum for him. He wasn't sure what was going on, and he realized that one of the things that both of these rats had in common was that basically they were lab rats and that they were being exposed to sort of some cold, unnatural stressors of being poked and handled and put into cold, probably metal cages. So that's when he started to explore whether these stressors were actually creating the ulcers or the physical symptoms in the rats, and hence we found that stress is actually problematic and can actually make you sick. Now, the other thing that he found, though, is that the body really reacts the same to all stressors, and that is something that we cannot stress enough. So as you will be hearing Dr. Sobolski's lectures, he'll probably say this about how we really see the stressor of maybe being chased, running for our lives, nowadays almost as the same as getting a surprise exam tomorrow that we feel unprepared for. So fortunately, we're not the best differentiators of what kind of stress is actually life-threatening and requires that kind of fight or flight mode, and which kind of stress is just kind of circumstantial. So first, there is a distinction between stress and a stressor. So stress is basically your perception. So it's when we perceive something as threatening, harmful, or like a challenge. That is when, you know, if we were in class, if it wasn't COVID times, if I would say, well, pop quiz, you know, that'd be kind of like the reaction if you get a little antsy, I didn't read the chapter. Now the stressor, though, that is the event. So that is me saying, you guys have a pop quiz. And this is what's going to trigger the coping mechanism. So not all stressors are the same for people. So for some individuals, maybe if you're well prepared, a pop quiz, you know, is fine, whatever. But if you've been doing poorly, if you woke up late, if it's not a good day, it might feel like a stressor and therefore produce stress. So the biopsychosocial approach to this has the three main aspects. The first one is the biological process, and this is the response that we have physiologically. So this is the hormones, the cortisol that gets activated, everything that kind of happens in our body that gives us a fight or flight response. Psychological influences are more about the person. So this is a little bit more related to personality. For example, people who are high on the neurotic scale of the personality dimensions that we have out there, we usually have two different theories, the 5 and then the 3 personality theories, but both of those theories both support the fact that there's a neurotic kind of personality feature. So this is how like antsy you are, how worried you are, and that can be different from person to person. Second is appraisal. So again, somebody might see the same stressor but appraise it differently. You might be able to see maybe being unable to get into one class at a certain time as being just like, well, unfortunate, whereas somebody else might be super stressed out because they made the whole plan around that time span and now they have to rework their whole plan. So that is the appraisal process. And then the final one is the social cultural factors. This is kind of what I focus more in my research. It has to do with a lot of factors that are kind of culturally bound. Life events are one. For example, if a person is changing jobs, it might be kind of stressful, but it's also depending on the culture. For some cultures, it's kind of normal to switch jobs often, and for some, it's not. Millennials are a good example of this. So for millennial generation, there tends to be this tendency for them to switch jobs into 3 or 4 years apart. Whereas this is something that was really not seen as very common and almost even stressful for people in the boomer stages, where they kind of just went to one job and kind of stayed there forever, maybe even 20 years or such. Daily hassles is another social cultural factors, and that's because, again, what is considered a hassle is going to be very cultural dependent and context dependent. Culture and family are also aspects. So example of this would be for like traffic. If you are in traffic in LA, obviously that's stressful. But let's say LA traffic and Corpus traffic are two different kinds of traffic, okay? So if I had a person move from LA to Corpus, they would be like, this is easy peasy, this is not traffic, I'm no longer stressed. Now if we have somebody from Corpus move to LA, I could probably bet that the daily hassle of the stress factor of that can be very, very heavy. And that's why, again, social cultural factors are based on context. So stressors, again, they could be minimal from daily hassles to major things. Significant life events are basically big things that are happening. So this would be like when you're moving, when you're deciding to go to college, when people get married, when they have children. So they don't necessarily have to be bad. They could also be positive, like having a child. But just the notion of having a child does change a person's life. So that's why we call these life change events or life change units. Significant life events were first addressed by Holmes and Ray, who kind of wanted to understand what things were the most stressful for people. So they took a long time and they interviewed a bunch of people, somewhere in the thousands, and really asked them, what kinds of things changed their life the most. And they came up with a hierarchy. If you Google it, you can definitely find some of the most life-changing events, and some of these are like getting a divorce, losing a partner, or losing a child. So those are up there. And what they found it was, again, that the amount of change in their life was consistent with how much stress the event would undertake. Following their work, some researchers used their life change events units theory, and they applied it to sailors. So what they wanted to do was understand how stress would impact people if you could kind of control where they were at. So in this case, they surveyed a bunch of sailors who went on a 6-month voyage. So theoretically, they're all having kind of the same environment, right? They're all out in the boat, having duties, having food, going to bed, I guess it's similar as it gets. But obviously they all have their different personal lives, and often they would have letters, they would have maybe girlfriends break up with them, they would potentially maybe lose parents or friends, and all this was basically examined, and what they found was that the sailors that reported the most stressors, they also reported the most illness. So this is kind of one of the basic studies that try to first explain how stress and illness was related in humans. So next I want us to kind of think about this question for a bit. So who is the most stressed out? Is it children, adolescents, or adults? In this case, would it be my 10-year-old? Who sometimes stresses out because I do not let him play Fortnite as long as he wants. My adolescent, who maybe wants to hang out with her friends a little bit longer, or maybe wants some new pairs of jeans. Or is it me, who I say it's me? But when you kind of think about adults, the term adult is a very wide range, right? You can see potentially maybe your grandparents who are now adults and also retired, who are maybe having really nice lives. So the key here is to define what adulthood starts. So how we define adulthood has really actually changed in the last. That is because it used to be that there was a clear point where adolescents became adults, right? Legally, I guess that would be 18. At 18, you can do most things, except for drink. So maybe is it legally 21? That is where the question lies. In today's world, this adulthood stage has actually been extended. So now we have a new stage that we call the emerging adulthood, and that is because there's this kind of prolonged adolescence that is sort of not quite independent, but still more independent than adolescence, and yet still attached to parents, that is out there, and that is what we call the emerging adulthood stage. Most of you are probably in this stage. That is when you're trying to leave home, become financially stable, maybe get a career, potentially finish college, do all those things. But emerging adulthood stage was not necessarily a thing in the 1960s, 1970s. It kind of developed as we became more financially stable, as things increased too. I mean, college has definitely increased in cost. This stage has also been identified worldwide, so it's not necessarily just something that came out of the US. It is definitely more prominent in societies that are more financially stable and more like first world, have more technology and such, but it is something that has been worldwide. Now, the interesting thing about this stage is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. So on one end, it's kind of seen as the most fun, exciting, freedom-rich, but also very stressful. So this is when, again, people are kind of doing their own thing, living their best life, so to speak, trying to kind of do the things that make them happy, but they're also still trying to establish themselves individually, financially, career-wise, identity-wise, and those things can be kind of difficult. So nowadays we also live in a culture that requires more education in order for you to make more money, and unemployment can be an issue. I mean, we are in a pandemic, so definitely that's still a thing. And all this has kind of been postponed. So things that used to dictate when people were adults, such as marriage, has also been postponed. The time period, very stressful. If we were having a discussion, I'm pretty sure many of you would have all kinds of answers, including moving. Maybe some of you moved to Corpus. Maybe during the pandemic, now you moved back home, and that can be stressful. Changing jobs, trying to make progress, feeling like you're not moving ahead as much as you can. This is also probably a side effect of all that social media stuff, kind of having that social comparison availability all day long. And again, some of these things are kind of fun, such as trying to maybe figure out your job can be fun, or it can also be kind of stressful. It depends on how you look at it. So for this week, you will be reading an article that addresses all these stressors and how they're related to physical manifestations of health. It's a pretty recent article from 2020. So it will be part of your quiz. Make sure to read it. So going back to daily hassles, again, daily hassles is kind of an interesting thing. This is kind of our daily stressors. When we think about how stressful our day is, this is probably what you're thinking about. You know, you're thinking of whether you walked outside and forgot your umbrella, whether you forgot your keys, whether there was a lot of noise, whether people were being very obnoxious and not letting you study at the library, whether you forgot your wallet, whether maybe there was traffic in an unexpected construction site, the internet wasn't working, I forgot my charger. So all those daily kind of things. And overall, there is also research that supports that this has actually the most significant impact on our health. But it really depends on the duration, intensity, and the frequency. So basically, if you have a couple weeks of persistent hassles, does that mean you're going to have a lot of health problems? Probably not, but if this in the long run you do, and we're talking months, years, then yes, there is a higher correlation between the daily hassles and health problems that outweighs major life events, and also the frequency of uplifts. And uplifts would be considered kind of like a coping mechanism. An additional stressor to this nowadays is actually remembering our mask. I had this just last week or so where I had to go to my daughter's game, and then it was raining outside, and it was windy and miserable, and I had to go out there, and then I forgot my mask, so then I had to go all the way back, and of course, that was very unpleasant. So another area where we have a lot of stressor is work. So work-related stress is something that we all have at some point. Whether it's maybe coworkers, whether it's feeling like things are overwhelming, maybe things change. There's always some kind of a stressor related to work. But it is also one of the most preventable stressors that we could benefit in addressing, and it could reduce some of the health hazards that it provokes. And some of this could be potentially from making sure that the environment is a healthy environment, and I'm talking about the culture, the values, the camaraderie, the value of diverse people, the kind of overall just notion of work environment. There's even we could even take this a step further and kind of promoting, for example, people to take their lunches, and maybe even there's some sites, bigger kind of companies, that have even implemented having some meditation rooms or some gyms in their facility as a way to promote their employees to become active and maybe even take again, that hour or 15 minutes of lunch in order for them to do these things. So work can definitely be an area that can be kind of culturally shifted to reduce stress for everyone at some point. Now, combining work and family, that is one of the spaces that produces the most stress. And this is true for everyone, but is definitely true for women who still continue to do the majority of the work. If we look at the data of who does more of the child care, the child pickup, laundry, all those kind of small household things that add up, or there's no more toothpaste, definitely you do see that women tend to do more of that. So they have what we call the role overload, and where they're kind of having a problem juggling the multiple roles simultaneously. For example, you might have somebody who might need to take off of work an hour early, potentially maybe skip their lunch in order to pick up their child and take them to an after-school activity. All that kind of promotes overload of stress. Now, there are a couple theories. I'm just going to briefly talk about enhancement theory, and that one kind of says that it also is true that people who juggle these roles of being a parent and being a full-time worker do also feel kind of a sense of pride or a sense of kind of happiness in doing these things, so that in a sense, it is stressful, but it also kind of enhances their sense of being. So that is one of the reasons why people continue to do this, even though, again, it's pretty stressful and difficult at times. So burnout is also another topic in health psychology that has been explored kind of substantially. There's a lot of specific jobs that appear to have higher likelihoods of burnout, and this includes healthcare workers, and this is pre-pandemic. So imagine the pandemic burnout of this current year is probably going to be horrible. Dentists, paramedics, air traffic controllers, and also counselors tend to exhibit a lot of burnout. Air traffic controllers are actually one of the highest stressed out jobs, and that has to do with just how much detail and attention and focus they have to do, and how much pressure there is to obviously not make any mistakes, because it can be pretty detrimental. The thing with burnout, though, is that it's not an inevitable employment consequence. So we could potentially fix this if you use the right tools, if we think critically, if people implement, again, this idea of creating a good work environment. For example, if some of you want to be counselors, there are some intentional things out there, like taking on certain cases that might be higher stress level, let's say like sexual abuse or such, with some of them that are a little bit less stressful, such as maybe doing premarital counseling where people are joyfully going to therapy and trying to just be the better selves in order to make a great partnership. So there are things that can be done, and that is true across all these. So the aspects that do increase stress in jobs are kind of related to the intersection of a couple things. So first we have job stressors, and again, all jobs have stressors. Sometimes it's your boss, sometimes it's your coworkers, sometimes it's just not having enough time to complete certain projects. So then we have moderators, and this is related to something that makes something worse or something better. That's what a moderator is. It's kind of like a leverage of either buffering or exacerbating a result that was already there. So this is based on individual and contextual factors. So a person who's optimistic will probably deal with job stressors a lot better than a person who is a little bit higher on neuroticism and maybe more pessimistic insight. Contextual factors, so that can be the work environment. Now, among these things, a big factor that has to do with how much a person stresses over the job stressors is how much control they have. And this is a model by Robert Karasek. In this case, he was really addressing that it's not all about the demand of the job, that there are some very demanding jobs out there where people aren't that stressed out, that they almost see the demand as sort of like a challenge, as, you know, it's a very invigorating, fast-paced kind of place, and people are potentially happy. There's also some jobs that are kind of not very high speed, and they're more passive jobs, and people are very unhappy with those. So it really had to do with the intersection of two things, and that would be the job demanding or physiologically demanding job, or not, if it was kind of more passive, but also the decision and the control factor. So a passive job, a low demanding job, something that, is kind of easy to go, and you don't have a lot of decisions, is not going to be too bad. It's just a job that you do. Maybe you don't get any say in how you do it, but it's pretty passive. A job that is both high demanding, but there's a lot of control in it, so high control would be considered an active job. And those jobs, again, if they attract people who like that kind of environment, might not necessarily be totally stressed out because they feel like they have control. Now, high strain jobs would be a place that has a lot of demand and no decision making. So this is the biggest kind of area where you have the highest risk for psychological and physical stress related illness. And that, again, it would be a job where you can't control the shots and there is just a lot of demand on you. For this chapter, this is the last portion that I will be talking about, and that is the physiology of stress. This is obviously a psychology class, so I wish we could have more time to address all the various really cool kind of brain, hormone, cortisol level chemical structures of how they interact with our health and our stress to produce these illnesses, but we don't really have that time. But overall, that is why I'm having you see the Dr. Sapolsky's lectures, as he is an expert definitely in that field of how stress and the endocrine system. Now, first of all, just want to address the fight or flight response. So this is the response that we have when we have a stressor. Something happens, we realize it's a challenge, it's an issue, something needs our attention, and then we have stress. This was an adaptive thing that came from our ancestors. Again, probably the Homo sapiens out there that did not see the bear as a stressful situation to run did not make it, so they did not pass on their passive genes, and that's why nowadays, most of us, if we would see a bear, we'd be very stressed out. So it was a good thing. It was a good thing to realize there's danger, move. However, modern day times, we again see dangers in areas that are not necessarily dangerous, that are not necessarily lethal to us, or that will provoke a lot of consequences. So our body's overall reaction of how we react to stressors or experience stress is really regulated by the central nervous system. And specifically, we have two systems in place that act as what I would kind of consider as a gas pedal to action, like if something happens and your body mobilizes, or a brake pedal to let you know that you're fine and to slow down. The gas pedal, which is what we're going to be talking about right now, is the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the system that really gets your body going. So it activates your muscle, it tells your brain that something's going on, it activates the glands and sends out all these cortisol hormones, and it just gets you ready for action, basically. So it mobilizes our body to defend and to survive, in a sense. It's specifically managed by the sympatho-adrenal medullary axis, which is a mouthful. We'll just call it the SAM axis. So the SAM axis is that initial response, and what it does is it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are neurotransmitters that then direct some specific parts in our brain, specifically in our reptilian brain. So we have 3 sections in our brain, and the most primitive brain, which is kind of like what we need to breathe, and in a way kind of what developed first in terms of our brain structure, that is what it handles a lot of this fight response. And in this case, it's the adrenal medulla, which is again in that lower part of your brain. So again, short-term response, so okay, what was that noise? Is something going on kind of response is going to be that short-acting activation. So it gets you ready, kind of turns you on. And that is mitigated by the epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's going to get everything going. There's an adrenal gland in your kidney, and then there's some glands in your brain that do that. Now, the long-term stress response, that is definitely mitigated or controlled by other parts of your brain, which are a little bit higher acting. So they're not quite in that reptilian brain. And that includes the hypothalamus, and that is a lot of the memory kind of area. And that is what releases our cortisol into our bloodstream and really get us going also. This is why the difference between short-term and long-term stress can be very different. And where most of the research points at is that this long-term stress response is really what contributes to the health issues in individuals, which is what we would call our chronic stress, or that daily hassles chronic stress. If this long-term response is also responsible for kind of getting us back to homeostasis. So it does release cortisol, it does continue the stress response activation, but it also slows it down. And that is also one of the key factors of how stress impacts our health, because if this second stage HPA axis is slower to get us back to normality, and it delays the response, or keeps us in this chronic stress for longer than it should be, that is when it becomes an issue, because then you have this ongoing stimulation of the hormone over your body all the time, and it just becomes problematic. Now the problem here is that if the HPA is not shutting down this long-term cortisol-infused activation, then it starts to actually damage our body. So it is precisely in the lack of stopping it and getting us back to homeostasis in an adequate amount of time that some of the deterioration happens. So basically, that is really where the stress illness relationship happens. It's not in that quick fight or flight activation, but it's in the prolonged not going back to normality and feeling like everything's good again. And if you continue to have a lot of these daily hassles, what happens is that the system kind of becomes out of place. So it starts to delay more than it should. It starts to just continue to pump your blood with too many of these hormones when you really don't need them, and it doesn't get you back to homeostasis as quickly as it should. And that is a huge area of research that is ongoing, and we'll probably continue to learn more about as we have more and more technology that can test this. For the test, do review the cardiovascular reactivity relationship between that and stress. I'm not going to cover it today for lack of time, but this is the area, again, where that kind of explains why there's plenty of research that supports that this meditative practices, the focusing on well-being, actually has a lot of biology and a lot of truth to it, which is really related to, again, those two systems of kind of the brake and the accelerator, and making sure that our brake is good, that it's not, that we're not, I don't know, for lack of a better term or better comparison, overusing our brakes and kind of getting rid of our brake pads a little sooner than it should be. So read all this and finish the chapter, as it will be included in the test. And that is it for